Hello, this is Ksenia from Functional Clothing Lab, and this is a second video, like a sequel video about bias tape. So check out the first one, which talks about basically making bias tape, single-folded, double-folded bias tape, and has a lot of information about what is bias tape and what it is for. This video has other hints and advices that I myself learned since recording the first video while working with the bias tape and finding better ways of using it, storing it, or producing it. So after the first video, I received few comments suggesting that I try cutting the fabrics with rotary cutter instead of scissors. And I tried, and indeed it is faster and more precise way to cut. While shooting this video, I had only small cutting mat, so I had to shift it around a lot to cut longer pieces of bias tape. But since then, I have actually improved my cutting setup by getting 4 large cutting mats that cover almost whole surface of my table. And now I use it to cut about everything, and not just bias tape. So all the garments that I make, I don't cut with scissors anymore. It is faster and more precise and less tiring for the wrist to do it that way. So I highly advise to try. Few notes about the grip of the rotary cutter. I found that holding cutter at approximately 90 angle to the arm is the best. It's least tiring. It is the most natural position for the wrist itself, because if you hold it more like a box cutter, you know, this kind of knife, the wrist would have been bent under the tension in the quite unnatural position. But if you hold it like, I don't know what to compare, what other tool do you hold that way? I don't know. But if you hold it like you see it in the video, basically, your wrist is in the most natural position, and it's not getting tired from even cutting a lot continuously. Also, it's easier to apply pressure that way. Now, next improvement. Some updates on storing the tape. In the initial tutorial, I just wound it on the piece of cardboard, which works fairly well, but winding it on some empty thread bobbin is so much better. So now when I make bias tape, when I pass it through bias tape maker, right behind the iron, I start winding it on a bobbin so that it preserves the creases. Some fabrics hold creases better, but for example this orange one tends to open if you don't wind it on something right after the ironing. So in order to prevent the best fold, I wind it directly on the bobbin right after the iron. Once the first pass is finished, if you aim to make a double folded bias tape, just start opening one bobbin, iron it, and wind it on another bobbin. So it goes between bobbins from one to another, also quite neat. But why storing it on the bobbin is better than just on a piece of cardboard? First, because you avoid creases that might be created on the edges of the cardboard when the tape wraps around the edges. But second, and most important, it is that you can put bias tape bobbin next to the thread bobbin on your sewing machine, and it will feed nicely while you're sewing. So you would need just to pull bias tape as you apply it, and the bobbin with bias tape would stay in place, would not unwind, would not roll around behind your sewing machine. So it's all quite contained and nice. Next tip. When you apply bias tape to the corner, one side of which is already finished, you can fold bias tape inwards, just a few centimeters, and apply it as usual. But because you have folded it inwards, raw edge would be hidden inside. In this case, I also use pin to hold the folded tape in place, just to avoid any misalignment when I start sewing. And then I just continue applying tape as usual. Also note that because we create double folded bias tape manually, and it's not always perfectly folded in half. Sometimes underneath side of bias tape could be slightly more narrow than the part that you see on top. So you have to account for that, and to be safe, stitch 1.5 millimeter away from the tape edge, so that it surely catches the underside as well. You see, it still happens sometimes, even when I try to play safe. But it's okay, I will go again from the back side. And I'll show you another way of finishing the corner. You can fold under a few centimeters. This way, raw edge is not actually fully hidden, but in this case, whole seam allowance would be folded when zipper is attached to it, and raw edge would be actually hidden after the garment is completed. This way is just a little faster, even though less neat. It is suitable in some cases. In the last part of this video, I will show you how to use single folded bias tape as a hem finish that as well can serve as a cord channel. I will not show exactly how to do cord channel, but you can guess and do it yourself. So first, put a bobbin with bias tape, with single folded bias tape next to the thread bobbin. Here is the hem. Open one side of single folded bias tape, align it with the hem of the jacket. Seam allowance of the hem should be half width of bias tape for a clear reason. You actually don't need necessarily bias tape to finish your hem as long as the hem of the jacket is straight. Then you can just make single folded tape out of the straight grain piece of fabric, meaning just cut horizontal piece out of the fabric width and pass it through the bias tape maker. And it would be okay because you don't need to go around the curves. But if it has curves, then that's where bias tape plays an important role. So stitch bias tape to the hem, then understitch. So let me explain what is understitching if you are not familiar. Understitching is stitching through seam allowance and lining or facing that you attach to the main piece. This operation is done to prevent lining from showing on the face of the garment when it's turned inside out. This operation is especially important when the main fabric and the facing or lining or hemming, the bias tape itself is different colors, like in this example, so that this color of the fabric that is underneath is not showing on the face of the garment. Also, understitching is important for curved edges because it allows to cut out or incise seam allowance in order so that the garment can lay flat when turned inside out. Because otherwise, you can of course just attach bias tape and then cut off 70% of the width of the seam allowance, but then and it will lay flat. But then it would be dangerous, meaning that it could fray on the inside because seam allowance would be so small and there would be just one stitching line. This could fray in the washing process or even in the regular wear. So understitching prevents it because it adds one more line of stitching, and it's much safer to just cut down seam allowance or make incisions. Especially it is important if you are finishing armholes in sleeveless garments or necks in collarless garments. So here it nicely lays in a way that face fabric is slightly turned on the inside. It's hard to show in the video, but you feel it after understitching when you turn the facing or lining on the inside. You feel how the edge is forming itself and the face fabric is slightly turning on the inside, and it just lays without effortlessly, it lays that way the way you want it. And then finish hem by just stitching the top part of the tape to the garment. Then iron it, and you see it lays flat, and the orange bias tape doesn't show on the face of the dark blue garment. That's about it regarding news about bias tape making, storing and applying techniques. If you have any tips of your own, feel free to share with me. I will appreciate that.